In 2014, we got Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, and 3 years later, in 2017, we got Middle-earth Shadow of War, but what exactly changed over those 3 years when it comes to attention to detail? So hello guys, and welcome to my direct comparison of Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor versus Middle-earth Shadow of War, two of my favorite games from the previous generation of consoles. I adore both these games, so I'm really looking forward to talking about them today in this video. And if you're new to my channel, welcome to Live from My Basement, where I make cool new videos like the one you're watching right now every single week, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. But guys, let's dive into the video. So what is a shadow game for those who don't know? A shadow game is an action game set in Middle-earth with gameplay similar to that of the Batman Arkham games, but instead of beating up criminals, you're slashing up orcs with gameplay centered around fantastic combat, serviceable stealth, and kick-ass wraith abilities. Wraith abilities like being able to brand orcs to be able to build your own orcish army, but the real focus of the gameplay is that around the Nemesis system. The Nemesis system allows you to create unique stories with the orcs and Mordor.
We both want to kill each other, so one of us will be dead.
Take this random no-name orc slave, for example. Whenever he kills the player, he actually becomes a named character within the world, being promoted to a captain, and will actually remember you whenever you see him next time within the open world.
See this scar? I got it because of you.
These systems are constantly creating unique experiences for the player that make the game different every single time you play. But when it really comes to the differences between these two games, it really comes down to scale, as everything that Shadow of Mordor did is just made bigger in Shadow of War. Take the locations for example, whereas in Shadow of Mordor you only had two explorable locations, those being Udun outside the Black Gate and the Sea of Nirn with its lush green forests. Whereas in Shadow of War you have more than double the locations you can explore, from the ash-covered plains of Gorgoroth, the Tower of Cirith Ungol, the snow-covered mountains of Saragost, the Forest of Nirn returns as well, and even a desert biome if you get the expansions. But when it comes to the gameplay, the real difference in the star of the show is the addition of fortress sieges in Shadow of War. These epic assaults actually give you something to do with your orc armies that you've been building throughout the game, which actually solves an issue that I had with the original game. I also love that cosmetically, these aren't just the same orcs you've been running into throughout the open world, but are actually fully equipped for war, head to toe covered in armor and war paint to boot. As conquering these fortresses through siege actually gives you a sense of conquering Mordor itself, as you have to take each fort in each region of the game. Not to mention these siege battles are infinitely replayable, as every battle has its own unique war chiefs and captains that each have their own perks and abilities. And on top of that, confronting the standing orc overlord in charge of the fortress you just siege is always an awesome way to end the battle. But it's not just conquering the fortresses, but defending them from Sauron's armies as well, and in my opinion, defending them is just as much fun as conquering them, as you actually get to choose how you want to set up the defenses by choosing new orc war chiefs and captains to actually defend the fortress, and choose what kind of defenses do you want to have. Do you want to have spiked walls or flames that you could dump on the attackers? It's completely up to you, and it's super fun to organize. Another cool difference between the two games is actually the addition of orc tribes in Shadow of War, as in Shadow of Mordor, all the orcs you would encounter were completely randomized, and even the orc captains and war chiefs were basically just randomized bosses. Whereas in Shadow of War, all of the orc captains and war chiefs' perks and traits, and even their cosmetic look, stems from what tribe they belong to. So if an orc captain is from the Feral tribe, you can expect him to be covered in furs and pelts, whereas if an orc captain is from, say, the Terror tribe, you can expect him to be covered in dark armor covered in human skulls. Not to mention, whenever you conquer a fortress, you get to appoint a new orc overlord to the region, which, depending on the orc's tribe, changes the cosmetic look of the landscape, which is pretty sweet. But it's not just cosmetics, as depending on the Orc Overlord's tribe, you actually get to affect the gameplay of the surrounding region, whereas if you choose an Orc of the Feral tribe to be Overlord, you can expect to see more things to summon beasts like dragons into the open world, which is awesome. Another pretty sweet addition between the two games is that in Shadow of Mordor, the primary enemy that you're fighting are the Orcs themselves, with every Orc war chief and captain being made of, obviously, Orcs. While in Shadow of War, the enemy ranks have been bolstered with the Olog High, or the Trolls, and it's absolutely awesome to see them appear in this game, as they were sorely missed in the original Shadow of Mordor, and on top of all that, the Trolls can actually become war chiefs themselves, which is pretty sweet.
You are more foolish still.
Not to mention the beasts and wildlife of Mordor saw some advancements in Shadow of War, as the Caragors and Graugs return in Shadow of War, though the Graugs actually have elemental versions, which are pretty sweet to see. And being able to mount the Graugs and actually use them during the fortress sieges is something I always love to do, and being able to just climb over the walls and run around is just something that doesn't get old. But the true star of the show here is the addition of the Flying Flame Drakes, as every time one of them shows up in a battle, it always steals the show. Laying waste to the Orcs of Mordor from Dragonback is just one of those gameplay elements that keeps dragging me back to Shadow of War, and not to mention exploring the regions from the back of a dragon and seeing the world from a whole new perspective is truly awesome. But another key difference between the two games is actually how loot works, as in Shadow of Mordor, whenever you take down an Orc war chief or a captain, he drops a rune that you can then equip to your weapon. Whereas in Shadow of War, whenever you take down an Orc captain or a war chief, he actually drops a piece of equipment that you can equip on your character. These pieces of equipment range from new swords and daggers to even new cloaks and chest armor, which not only provide new buffs and perks, but also cosmetically change your character within the open world, which is something we did not see in Shadow of Mordor. But there are a couple things I've always felt Shadow of Mordor did better than Shadow of War, one of which is actually how your character navigates the open world, whereas in Shadow of Mordor, your character has more of a sense of weight in this game as he slowly moves through the environment, and it actually feels like your character is a bit more grounded in the world. Whereas in Shadow of War, there's more gameplay elements at play that focus on moving your character through the environment quickly, as anytime you're running or climbing, your character is just zooming through the environment, and this actually makes you feel a little less grounded in the world. But when it really comes to the differences between Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, a lot of people like to remember just how pure Shadow of Mordor was when it first launched, and still is, whereas when they think of Shadow of War, they think about how when the game launched, it had an in-game microtransaction store, and it being a single-player game, it's pretty unacceptable, as it didn't really add anything to the game, and it was only intrusive, and though it has since been removed from the game and you can enjoy it without any microtransactions, it's a shame that it was ever included in the first place. Well guys, you made it to the end. Thank you for watching this direct comparison of Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor versus Middle-earth Shadow of War. And as I said at the beginning of the video, two of my favorite games from the previous generation of consoles, and I adore both of them. I love Lord of the Rings, so I was very much looking forward to these Lord of the Rings games as they were releasing. And one fun little piece of information is that I actually won a GameStop sweepstakes for Shadow of War and actually got sent a free Mithril edition of the game, which just kind of fueled my hype for that game. But either way, at the end of the day, a lot of people, when they think of these two games, they think Shadow of Mordor is amazing and Shadow of War is bad, and I just don't think that's true. I think they're both incredible games. It's a shame that Shadow of War launched with its microtransactions in the store, but I mean, if you go and you play it now, you'll never even realize that it was ever there. The gameplay was not held back by the greedy microtransactions, but you know, they've since been removed from the game, and I think Shadow of War is a fantastic game. And if you never played it because of the reviews back when it first came out, definitely go and check it out, especially if you're a fan of Shadow of Mordor. Shadow of War, in my opinion, is everything Shadow of Mordor was, but bigger and grander in scale, and I love that game for that. But guys, that's all I have for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to drop a like on the video. It helps the little video reach new fans, and as I always say, that's always a great thing. I also make new videos every single week, like the one you're watching right now, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future content, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya.